The car was first built in 2003, and it was a Nismo Motorsport Works program. That was the very first era of GT300 Z33 cars. It was a spare and endurance car for that season. So during that season, it would compete in your longer races, like your 500k Fuji events, Suzuka 1000 and things like that. Its sister car, which was built at the same time, was ran for the sprint races. In 2004, it was with the Dacian team, and that was in the Endless Blue livery, which is pretty famous as well. And then 2005 onwards to 2007, it ran 3 seasons with Team Mola. And then in 2008 and 2009, it was the endurance car for Team Mola as well. The car had wins under Team Mola at Suzuka 2008, 2009, and that was the 1,000 kilometre race. It was also part of the championship winning team for them for those 2 years. And it was also part of the championship winning team for Sami in 2003. The amount of money that the teams would invest to race these cars, everything was done purely just to win. There was no shortcuts taken, so they'd have a backup for everything and a solution for everything to get the championship. And a lot of the rounds in that season, or those seasons, were only 7 or 8 rounds. So the Nismo Z33 program had a few evolutions. The first one was the foundation of the Z33s was during the last years of what people would know as the Japanese Touring Car Championship. Late 2004, the cars moved to what would be the future Super GT program. And with that, body kits evolved, freedoms evolved in Aero and brake and tyre packages and things like that. How the car sits now is a final evolution of that program, which a pass down of technology essentially from GT500. A lot of the Super GT cars of that era were trying to be pushed into FIA homologation. The 350Z GT500 cars differed a fair bit. The main difference was front and rear of the firewalls, the cars were pure space frame. It gave Nismo and the teams the freedom to sort of develop a front end that was much lower but much wider. Yeah, there's a bit of an architecture carried over to the GT300 cars, but the GT500s, it was just a pure freedom racing category. The GT300 engine is a VQ35, so it is a road block and road cylinder heads. It retains all the camshaft layout and design that is on the road cars, but that's kind of where it stops because the valve train, the seats, the chambers, they're all specially machined. It has different sized buckets. The engine is kind of cut off at the base end of the block. They actually made the main caps and the retaining caps as part of the dry sump system. So visually, externally, it's the same, but internally, it's all special stuff. Previously, I had the Inisia XS15 GT300 car, which people know. There was a lot of time spent on restoring that car and getting it back to sort of somewhere near a raceable condition, because when I bought it, it had no drivetrain in it. Once I finally got that restored and built back up, the opportunity came to sell it to a collector. After that, I was sort of scouting around. I knew where this car had been and I was following it for a fair bit. The owner over there was kind of okay to move it on, and it took a while to get a deal done, but I ended up buying the car with all the Nismo spare works parts that were remaining, because one of the hardest things with these cars is maintenance and original parts. So the spares that I have with the car, 2 engines, 2 gearboxes, 2 diffs, uprights, brake calipers, 2 sets of dry carbon body panels, the radiators, oil coolers. I essentially picked up all the last remaining spare parts. It's even got an air conditioning system with it for the cabin as well. When the car arrived, it ended up sitting around for 2 years, and I really didn't get a chance to do any maintenance during that period. So consequentially, the whole car's been pulled down, the whole drivetrain's been out, everything's been inspected, lines have been replaced. So the condition it is now, it could turn key and do a 1,000 kilometre race, no problem at all. The first drive of it was probably a week and a half before Time Attack. Time Attack was really just a display event for us. It was a cool event. We knew the car would not be competitive. We knew it's not its event. It's not what it's designed for. We had a lot of issues actually running the Yokohama tyre. The control tyre, unfortunately, is a bit narrow in overall height, and the sidewall's a lot shorter. The byproduct of that in this aerodynamic kit on the car caused a lot of turbulence in the wheel wells, and that started stalling the front splitter. And so you had a situation where the front splitter's sucking down, then stalling, then flexing back up, and that oscillation caused a few cracks in it, and that was kind of terminal for the weekend, that we didn't want to push it and have bits of carbon flying off everywhere. And so after Time Attack, GDR Festival came up. We got the invite, got the offer, and said, yeah, let's do it. Take the car down the quarter mile. I don't think we've seen a Nismo GT car ever do a quarter mile. I can't find any record of it anywhere, let alone other GT3 cars. So I thought, why not? It's a great opportunity. It did a respectable time, low 12, 118 mile per hour. So for the horsepower and the weight of the car, that's pretty healthy. And these are the type of cars that if you don't use them, they go backwards in terms of maintenance. The level of engineering and mechanical design on all the components in the car is designed to take stresses. I don't want it to sit there and do nothing. It's designed to be enjoyed, and it's not going to damage it or hurt it. I'm going to do whatever I can with the car. So put on the trailer, and if it means roll racing, I'll do that. If it means super sprints, I'll do that. If it means door-to-door, I'll do that.
Now, rather than rattle off a big tech list on this car, most of which you could probably find online, and a lot has changed over the years, I thought that I would take you over the car and just point out some pretty interesting features particular to this GT300 350Z. Now, first up, we're going to talk about Aero. Now, if you're a long-time viewer of our channel, you know that I studied aeronautical engineering in the Air Force. I have done a little bit of work with Andrew Brilliant in the past, and we actually have a two-part tech feature series on our channel that goes over the basic fundamentals of Aero and how it works on cars using our time attack car as an example. So I'm pretty familiar with the basics of Aero. Now, this car, as crazy as it looks, the Aero on this car is actually relatively straightforward and basic. In fact, a lot of our time attack cars are more complicated in certain areas. But this car obviously would have had a lot of engineers from Nismo doing a lot of fine-tuning, CFD and testing on this car for all those little bits that you need for those extra tenths around the track. So first up, we're going to start with the front end. So the splitter on the car is actually pretty straightforward. It's actually not all that big, especially compared to what we do with time attack cars. Underneath, it has a diffuser section in front of the wheels and in the center a little bit, but it's actually not that crazy. The size of it's probably dictated more by the regulations as opposed to being able to do whatever they want with design. But where this splitter does get really interesting is this. Now, you can see the intake into where the radiator is, but there's a gap here in between the splitter and the duct. This bleed air that's allowed into here actually flows over the flat floor, but obviously in between the flat floor and the monocoque of the car. It obviously is quite turbulent. It goes under the engine and goes through all the suspension components and subframes, etc. And when it gets to the back, it helps re-energize the boundary layer of the rear diffuser and makes the rear diffuser more effective. So it doesn't need to be smooth the whole way to the back, because obviously the low pressure at the back helps suck it out and it smooths out as it comes over, and how turbulent that air is over the top of the rear diffuser doesn't matter so much. Now, the cooling duct of the radiator is pretty straightforward. The radiator is angled forward. The reason for that is you can imagine the air flows through, and as it goes up through the radiator, the air is going on the same angle as the radiator before it comes out through these massive negative pressure ducts in the bonnet. Now, there's probably more airflow here than it needs to keep the car cool, being a naturally aspirated, 300 horsepower car. But it's not just about the cooling, it's about getting air that's trapped here out of the engine bay and up over the car and get it moving. So displacing the most amount of air through there is the most important thing to reduce drag. Now, if you have a look here, you've got ducts for brake cooling. You can see here there's a little spot here where you can put block-offs. So depending on what track you go to is how much you can block off the brakes. And like in most forms of racing, the more you block the brakes, the more front downforce you get. So you're balancing downforce and cooling to the brakes. You've got these little holes either side here. One of them goes to the power steering cooler, and the other three are basically cooling air. Most of it goes into the cabin. You can also see these little ducts here in the front. These are just designed to let a little bit of bleed air into the engine bay just to help manage the temperature of the engine and heat soak in the engine bay. The bleed air that goes in through here actually ends up getting pulled out through the back of the engine bay to the back of the front guard. So there is actually, I guess, a path where the air is designed to go. So bleed air through here just helps with general cooling of the engine itself. The most interesting thing in the front, though, is this. This is the air inlet into the intake and airbox. And basically, the best way to explain this is the faster this car goes, the more air builds up in this intake and basically creates positive pressure. And the reason they're trying to do that in this naturally aspirated car and sort of ram air into the engine is they have two tiny little restrictors going into the airbox, and those two restrictors have a bell mouth on it, which you can see when you look in here. And how much air a bell mouth can flow when it's trying to suck air in, whether it's naturally aspirated or turbo, has a certain limit. But once you are trying to jam air through that bell mouth, it can actually help it flow a little bit more. So by ramming air into the intakes, it's actually helping the thing flow more air through the restrictors. And the faster you go, the better it works. So essentially, the faster this thing goes, the more power it can make. The other thing you have to remember is when the throttles are closed, this has a giant airbox. So any air that's coming in here at 150, 200 kilometers per hour, as it's forced in through this intake, through the restrictors, through the intake pipes into the airbox, it'll actually pressurize the air inside the airbox while the throttles are closed. So when you get back on the throttle, you've got this big, I guess, big burst of air that it can then suck in to get a little bit of a boost in power. It's almost like a push to pass button, I guess, for a naturally aspirated car. So as it comes off the corner, it has an increase in torque and power. But we'll come back to that because we're getting sidetracked by the engine. We'll talk more about the Aero. So the dive planes or front canards on this car aren't so much for downforce as they are for controlling airflow around the car. The whole idea is with these is they're trying to get air to be forced away out and around the front tyre and wheel. A spinning wheel and tyre creates very turbulent air, and the more turbulent air around here as it gets trapped inside the fender creates a high pressure zone, which obviously creates front end lift. So what they're trying to do is create a boundary layer kind of away from the car so that all of the other clean air over here, rather than hit the side of the car, it hits the boundary layer created by the vortices off these front dive planes. So they're meant to sort of, I guess, create a boundary layer around the wheel and tyre, which is then assisted by all of the design of this front guard, which is actually relatively complicated. Now, to get rid of all of the high pressure and zone and the air trapped inside the wheel arch, normally you'd see negative pressure ducts up on top, but the rules and regulations with GT3 didn't allow it. So the design of this front guard is trying to accelerate the air as it comes over the top of this back section of fender, which creates a low pressure zone behind this opening. So it's actually trying to suck air out, not of just the wheel arch, but there's actually a little vent in here into the engine bay as well. So the whole idea is to suck the air out to get rid of the high pressure zone inside the wheel arch. All of the design here is the same thing. It's trying to get turbulent air out of the wheel arch and get it out and around the car. So the boundary layer created by the vortices from the dive planes joins into this air, and it's basically trying to force air away from the side of the car. If you come down to the exhaust, very similar thing. They're actually using the exhaust system to try and blow air away from the car. And the reason they're trying to keep pushing air away from the car is because the more air that bleeds in under the flat floor, they're actually losing downforce. So they're trying to keep the air that started under the car to stay under the car, and any air that's out here in clean airflow or flowing around the car dirty, they're trying to minimize how much flows under the car and creates turbulence or stalls the airflow and reduces the effect of the rear diffuser and the flat floor. So all of this Aero has two purposes. Get rid of the high pressure zone and turbulent air from inside the wheel arch to help with downforce or to reduce front end lift. And all of the vortices and all the low pressure zones are designed here trying to create a boundary layer down the side of the car to keep all of the air flowing down the side away from the car and stop it from going underneath. So as funky as it looks, that's basically its entire purpose. So the rear wing is, well, pretty massive, but what's interesting about its design is not the size, it's actually, I guess, the shape and the altering shape of the wing. One thing to notice is the curvature of the front leading edge actually wraps back in, and you can see here that the chord length on this outer section is a lot smaller than what it is in this middle section, and there's a few reasons for this. Essentially, this sits lower than the roof height, so the air coming over the roof is not hitting this parallel to the ground. The air is sort of sloping down and hitting it on a different angle. The air hitting this middle section has a different angle of attack than what it does on this outer section that sits in clean air. Now, this section that sits in clean air, they want that to have better, I guess, downforce versus drag ratio. So it's a different design than what it is in the middle. This has to work harder to create downforce that's come over the roof itself. The gurney flap that's built into the edge along here, very aggressive. This is probably the high downforce option for this wing. They would have different ones based on different tracks, but as you can see, the design is pretty cool. End plates as per normal, but yeah, I love how this leading edge actually hooks back around and helps try to draw air along the leading edge inwards. So yeah, very interesting. The design changes from the middle to the outer edge of the wing, obviously designed specifically for this car rather than off-the-shelf wing. Next we're going to look at is these rear guards. These monster guards, very similar in design and the way they work to the front guards. As you can see, they are massive and stick way out. The wide body obviously designed to fit nice big rubber, but once again, you want to minimize how much turbulent air gets trapped inside the wheel arch, and you want to get that out. So the opening behind here is huge. It's trying to let all that turbulent air out. Now, once again, the air flowing over this back guard is accelerated to try and create a low pressure zone here. The wing and the back section of the car and the diffuser are all creating low pressure over here as well. And basically all this ducting inside the rear guard is same deal. It's all trying to create a low pressure out here to suck the air inside the wheel well. These canards are very similar to the front. They're trying to create a vortice out to the side here, which obviously helps keep the air going down the side of the car from sucking back in and joining with this air to keep it away from the car and reduce drag and make this low pressure zone more effective. So that's what this is all about. Once again, you could probably put negative pressure ducts on top, but it wasn't allowed in their class of racing. So the suspension and brakes is where this car differs from factory the most. The Aero looks obviously quite visually different, but the suspension under here is nothing like the factory car. It's all double A-arm, custom spherical jointed suspension arms that are fully adjustable with a custom upright for a center lock Nismo wheel. Nothing like factory. AP Racing brakes, pretty straightforward stuff. We know it's top quality. The one thing I find really interesting is it runs an 18-inch wheel, but look at the size of the sidewall on the tyres this thing runs. It's obviously noticeable that the front guard, the opening for the wheel arch is nearly as high as the bonnet itself. Obviously much bigger openings in the wheel arch than the factory car. And just check it out, look at that sidewall. If you were to put a normal, 265 35 18 onto this wheel, the floor would probably nearly touch the ground. That's how different the sidewall profile is on this car. Why is the sidewall profile so big? Well, I'm going to take an educated guess here that for a couple of reasons. One, so they can use the slick that they would like to use. And secondly, if you follow F1, you'll know that one of the biggest complaints of the new cars is the smaller profile tyre is a lot stiffer and it doesn't absorb any bumps in the road like the old larger sidewall tyre it is. But basically, a large sidewall tyre actually helps your suspension because it can take a lot of the little bumps. It can absorb all those little high-speed bumps around the track so that suspension can stay nice and stiff to work with the Aero. And obviously when you have a low profile sidewall tyre, it can't do that. So the big sidewall is probably partly to do with suspension and aero tuning and also to give them the type of slick that they want with the durability that they want. So that's probably one of the most interesting things about the suspension, brakes and wheels and tyres on this car is that massive sidewall. But yeah, pretty straightforward race car stuff, I guess, for suspension and brakes with this car. But obviously underneath is a lot more advanced than the 350Z is off the factory floor. So when you pull the rear hatch off, you can see just how much 350Z is still here. The actual monocoque part of the body is still 350Z. The 350Z inner wheel arches and the floor is mostly intact from a factory car. It's obviously modified for what they need to go racing, but some of the things you can see looking in here, you can see this big upright to hold the wings so that it mounts directly to the chassis. All the adjustment holes for the angle of attack are actually in here. You can see this central welded duct is where they actually run the fuel filler from the very back of the car into the tank, which is up under where a back seat would be. You can see the dry sump reservoir tank in the back and breather, and you can also see the duct in here, which goes to gearbox and diff coolers underneath the car. So pretty straightforward race car stuff in the boot, but still pretty cool to check out. So we covered this in our tech feature that for a rear diffuser to work efficiently and correctly into its full potential, it has to be joined to a flat floor. Essentially what you're doing is the entire underside of the car becomes an upside down wing. So you basically a wing of a plane, flip it upside down, you have that curve under the car where the whole idea is it accelerates the air under the car to create a low pressure zone and create downforce. Now, where that center of pressure is all dependent on the rake of the car, the shape of the floor, everything. Now, a wing on a plane has air going over the top and the bottom. So, where this diffuser meets the back of the car, if there wasn't a gap here, you would only have the air flowing under the car do the work. But what happens is, when you have air flowing over the top of the diffuser, where I talked about where it came in through that duct in the front, the air coming over the top actually helps re-energize the boundary layer around the back of the diffuser and helps it basically work more effectively. So inside the car is pretty straightforward race car stuff. Obviously a early to mid 2000s spec build, so some of it is a bit more old school, but everything you'd expect is here. You've got the gear lever for the Hewland 6-speed sequential gearbox. You've got a rear sway bar adjustment here. Rear brake control here. The reason that exists separate to the brake bias that you have in the pedal box is so that you can control how much braking force is going to the rear as you go through fuel in an endurance race. Plenty of ECU stuff here. There is wiring everywhere. Look at this. You always think that race cars from Nismo and other big places are going to have all this super neat wiring, but you've got to be able to get to it all as well. So it's all neat and out of the way, but there's a lot going on. You've got the firebomb, of course. You've got your pop-out fuses here, main control panel here, and the steering wheel is actually a relatively normal steering wheel, but it's not quick release. It's a flip up to help you get in and out, and it just has buttons on it and a little carbon plate with an extra digital dash. There's not a lot going on in here, to be brutally honest, so we'll switch her on. Up on the dash here, all you have, believe it or not, is RPM with a shift light, oil pressure in the middle, and water temperature at the bottom. You have a rear vision screen here, because obviously there's no rear mirror, so you can see what's going on. And over here you have your gear display indicator, and the rest of it is just a couple of warning lights. Looking around in here, another little thing that you notice is it has a factory 350Z door handle over here, which I think is pretty funny. Now, obviously it goes without saying, we need to start it up. This thing does sound pretty awesome, especially for a V6. Very hard to make them sound good. So, starting procedure in this car at the moment is power on. We actually lift the breakers for the fuel pump so that we can actually crank the car over for a little bit first and build some oil pressure. So, all right, so I built some oil pressure, and here we go. And there we go. It's obviously quite loud, a lot of vibration, very race car in here. But man, the V6 in this thing, for a naturally aspirated 350Z engine, it sounds pretty good. So this thing actually idles at about 1700 RPM when it's cold like this, but you can still hear just how cranky it sounds. It's definitely the best naturally aspirated V6 I've ever heard. It's got about 6 to 7 bar of oil pressure right now while the oil's cold. But what's really interesting is with the lightweight flywheel and the way this engine is set up with the 6 throttles, listen to this. That's only about 10-15% throttle, and it just blips to sort of 4,500-5,000 RPM like that. So very lightweight flywheel, lightweight clutch, etc. Very, very responsive on the throttle, which is it's like a motorbike.